Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar this morning, Navigating Medical Device Cybersecurity Waters, Regulatory Similarities and Differences between the EU and the US. We really appreciate everybody being here. We're going to kick it off with some introductions from our three panelists. Naomi, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Naomi Schwartz. I am the Vice President of Services here at MedCrypt. We are super focused on medical device cybersecurity here at MedCrypt and making sure that medical device manufacturers are designing in adequate security into their devices and documenting it appropriately so that they can get through regulatory bodies like the EU MDR process through the notified bodies and the US Food and Drug Administration. So our key focus at MedCrypt is helping you as manufacturers make sure that you are doing the appropriate things with cybersecurity and making sure that you're documenting them well. I will hand off to Christian.
Thank you, Naomi. My name is Christian. I'm from the consulting company Yona Institute. We are helping medical device manufacturers worldwide to get through the jungle of regulatory requirements. And I'm a consultant of that company and mainly focused on IT security and risk management.
Thank you, and I'll go last. Axel Worth, I'm the Chief Security Strategist here at MedCrypt, and thanks everybody for joining again. I'll kick off the first section here of the presentation. So today we're going to talk about cybersecurity in healthcare in general, a little bit of an introduction on why we actually are where we are today, talk about regulations and laws that impact medical devices and medical device manufacturers, and then have a deep dive in both the US position through FDA and the position over in Europe through MDR and IVDR, and then do a little bit of compare and contrast of those two different regulatory frameworks, and then close off with a couple of practical and strategic tips that everybody can take home from this. So just taking a step back before we get to medical devices. The healthcare industry is really in a difficult spot here. If you look at the graph on the left, it shows you, and other statistics document similar findings, that healthcare has become a target of ransomware attackers, right? It's the leading industry of being attacked. And we believe it's due to two things. One is that healthcare has a reputation of having a relatively weak security posture. One reason, and the second reason is that the pressure to restore operations in healthcare is much higher than in other industries, which means that a ransomware attacker is more likely to get paid. Unfortunately, as we can see on the example on the right, the consequences can go beyond just being financial. Here's an example of a hospital here in the US that actually had declared bankruptcy and cited ransomware impact on their revenue as one of the reasons why they had to declare ransom. And there have been a few other cases of these type of very severe consequences for healthcare providers. A little bit of background here for the non-US people on the call. Since 2009, under the so-called HIPAA breach notification law, healthcare providers, health insurers, and others that store and manage patient health information need to report data breaches that affect more than 500 individuals to Health and Human Services here in the US. So since 2009, we have full year data of the types of breaches. And we see here clearly that the category classified as hacking and IT incident went from being almost nothing in the early years to now being actually 80% of all reported breaches and actually affecting 94% of all breach records. And it also has been the sole driver of growth of breach events since 2015. So healthcare organizations have been doing better in every single category, have driven down breaches, except in the hacking IT incident category, where things have skyrocketed. Since we have data for now 14 years, we have reported a total of almost 6,000 breaches across the US, affecting almost 500 million patients. So those are just significant and staggering numbers, which show us that the healthcare industry really is in a very unfortunate position and is targeted by cyber adversaries at a significant rate. But there are also other consequences, right? So here's a study from the University of Minnesota from late last year that demonstrated that during a ransomware attack on a healthcare organization, there's an increase of 20 to 35% in mortality rate of patients in the affected hospitals. So that's a quite a concerning number if during a ransomware attack, which can actually impact an organization for weeks, if not a few months, you see that increase in mortality rate due to care delay, due to manual processes, and so forth. So that this is indeed quite concerning. Here's another study that showed a similar result, but also demonstrated that things like minor delays, in this case 2.7 minutes, to a patient receiving an electrocardiogram lead to a measurable increase in mortality rate even 3 years after a cybersecurity event. And the going theory is that is due to the fact that care is delayed, additional security measures, strong passwords, more complicated logins, and so forth, that has impact, unfortunately, on mortality rate, even for the future after the attack. And then here's another recent study, quite interesting, that shows very similarly an increase in mortality rate, in this case cardiac arrest, of non-affected hospitals in the region. So if one hospital has a ransomware attack and suffers a ransomware attack, and patients get diverted to other hospitals in the region, those hospitals then show a demonstrable impact due to capacity, due to delays of mortality rate. So clearly those three studies demonstrate that we need to be concerned about cybersecurity in healthcare, not because of direct patient safety impact, right? The, oh my God, somebody can hack into my pacemaker scenario has not played out yet. Not saying that it couldn't in the future, but what has played out yet is patient suffering and increase in mortality due to small delays in care delivery. And those three studies I picked out as an example here have demonstrated that, unfortunately. So now look at the big picture of medical device regulations and other regulatory implications that may affect the healthcare industry, right? So pretty much over the past years, regulators, lawmakers, governments across the world have raised the bar on cybersecurity, right? In healthcare certainly, but also across other industries. Here in the US, we have various federal agencies that have now, for example, instituted reporting requirements of cyber incidents, be it the Security and Exchange Commission, be it the Federal Trade Commission, be it the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Also, the US government has established cybersecurity rules, including documentation like software bills of material, for government acquisitions, right? So if you sell to the US government, including US government hospitals, you need to demonstrate a certain level of security and need to provide documentation that demonstrate that. And very similar in the EU, and Christian will speak about that in more detail later, under, for example, NIS2 and the Cyber Resilience Act, we have seen similar broad new laws and regulations that impact all companies, including healthcare providers. Similar, we have impact through data protection and privacy laws, right? We have had for a number of years now GDPR in Europe. We have for over 20 years now HIPAA here in the US. And we have also over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, US state laws developing that in many cases have actually stricter privacy requirements than US federal laws. For example, California, for example, Massachusetts, for example, New York, and most interesting, most recently, Colorado, that introduced a data privacy law that includes neural data that is derived by devices, including things like gaming devices and personal fitness and well-being monitoring devices. And then, of course, if you look across the globe and picking a couple of examples here about medical devices, we have had under TGA in Australia now cybersecurity guidances. And the reason I pick Australia here is because it's actually a very good, well-written document that is much more technical and practical than many of the other regulations that have come out that tend to be more abstract and strategic. Singapore, in response to the big data breach at Sing Health a couple of years ago, has established very strict medical data privacy laws and security laws for medical devices. So has Health Canada. And then there's an attempt through the International Medical Device Regulators Forum to start to harmonize. IMDRF is not regulatory binding. It is not law, but it is, again, an attempt to start to harmonize across the globe so that device manufacturers have a better aligned situation with regards to the requirements they need to meet. And hopefully in a couple of years, we get to that point. And we have seen other local trends in Japan, in China, Saudi Arabia. So really across the globe, the bar is being raised in non-healthcare as well as in healthcare security and privacy laws and regulations. And to summarize, a couple of examples here. So the White House, under the current administration, has published a number of strategic documents that basically guide the industries, including healthcare, on a path to better resilience in cyberspace. But it is needed to improve our national security, to protect our critical infrastructure, and to protect citizens' safety. Also, the trend is clear here that the liability is being shifted away from the operator, from the manufacturer of devices and software. No, let me start over again. Sorry about that. That the liability is shifted away from the operator of devices to the manufacturer of devices and software. So clearly, it is understood that the earlier in the device lifecycle you implement security, the better the security posture and the lower the total cost of security across the device's operating life will be. And then, of course, we have various government agencies that received additional authority through the White House security strategy, including the FDA, but also including CISA, that is more tactical in providing specific guidance documents under the umbrella of secure by design and secure by default, basically an approach to embrace transparency and accountability for security, build an organizational structure and leadership to support security, including the responsibility of executive leadership in a company, and make clear that security is important to business success. And then very tactical look at risk management, threat modeling during development to assure that the devices you're developing are indeed secure. As of late last year, December, we also now have under the SEC a rule that mandates that any publicly traded company that is traded on the various stock markets has now the mandate to report material cyber incidents within 4 days to their investors and to the public. So clearly that raises the bar on corporate and executive responsibility for cybersecurity for events that could materially alter a company's revenue flow and profit, and could therefore materially impact the investors in a company. And with that, I hand off to Naomi to talk about the FDA.
Sure. So in a deep dive, FDA has authority now under the law rather than the traditional approach of interpreting the risk management rules of the quality system regulation under Part 820. FDA officially now has statutory authority. That means that the US Congress passed a law that says FDA may ask for very specific information in a pre-market submission, whether it is a pre-market notification, a de novo filing, or a pre-market application. They may ask for this information, and if that information is not provided, they will not clear or approve a particular medical device. So rather than having interpreted language, regulation, or guidance, FDA now has official mandates to ask for this information. They can ask very specifically for plans to monitor in the post-market. They can ask very specifically for a detailed description of the processes and procedures that will provide assurance of security of these medical devices. And they can ask, and they will ask, for a software bill of materials. Now that is provided to the secretary, in other words, to FDA. It does not necessarily mean that you have to provide it to the public. But what you see in the way that the statute was written is that FDA is saying, we do not want to argue with manufacturers anymore about whether or not the risk management aspects apply. They do. Here's what we want to do about it. And they're enforcing it. The deficiency letters that we have seen, and there are many, many examples, get very specific, and they can go to any single line item in the guidance. But most of them are being framed within the context of what is referred to as Section 524B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So they're asking very specifically for a software bill of materials. Either you did not provide one, or you did not provide specific information, specific attributes, for example, the NTIA baseline elements, or you may not have provided level of support information for a particular software package. And when they're asking for that, that's actually not a baseline attribute. What they're really saying is not, hey, you got to know level of support for every software package. For many, there is no level of support. It may be open source, and it may or may not be supported at all. They want to know what you're going to do about a risk associated with having a software component that you do not control, that may not be supported. They want you to have a plan for reacting in the event that there is a cybersecurity disclosure relating to that software package that you are using in your medical device. So when they talk about each of these different deficiencies, the focus here really is, what can you do if something goes wrong? How quickly can you respond to it? And how are you going to inform your user base, whether it is a healthcare professional or a home user of the device or a laboratory technician? How are you going to inform people if something has gone wrong and what they can do about it? If we can go to the next slide, what we're really focusing on here is, understanding what FDA's expectation is. They are expecting post-market management. They're expecting that manufacturers have a plan and will follow that plan to monitor, identify, and address post-market cybersecurity vulnerabilities and exploits. And that means that when they appear on your doorstep for an inspection, they will be looking through your design history files, your records, to see whether or not you have had any indications of a vulnerability or an exploit. And they will be looking to see whether or not you're following your plan. Of course, they'll also be looking at your plan. This includes devices that are already on market at this point. If you have devices on market but did not submit that plan to monitor when you submitted your initial filing to FDA, say it was 6 years ago, they're expecting you to now develop a plan and be monitoring the potential for cybersecurity vulnerabilities in those devices because they're already on market. Traditionally in the US, they're grandfather claused. And so there's not an expectation of going back and resolving, but they are making clear in some of their most recent updates to the cybersecurity guidance that you do need to have plans regardless of when your device was submitted. You need to be managing cybersecurity in the post-market for all devices. And in particular, you need to be paying very close attention to your legacy devices. If a device is not patchable, you need to know what you can do in the event that something is happening with that device and it does become vulnerable, or particularly it starts to be exploited. And you also need to be able to do software and firmware updates to the extent that that is possible. If it's true legacy, it's not possible, and you're going to need to figure out what to do about that. But for devices that are on market that can be patched, FDA is expecting you to have a plan for that. And they really want you to understand how to ensure authenticity and integrity of the software update process. This is really, really important because you don't want to issue a patch and find out that somebody else out there can roll it back to an older version that is vulnerable and continue to exploit it. They want to know that you can ensure the integrity so that somebody else can't put out a patch to your device. And then you find out that that patch actually includes additional exploitation opportunities. So FDA is asking for a lot of detailed information now and a lot of very technical information now with respect to cybersecurity of devices that are going to market, but they're also looking for you to have a plan to manage your already on market devices. Next slide. So FDA's legal authority, it is really focused on security being a problem. There have been a number of devices that have had vulnerabilities identified and, in fact, in some cases exploited. There are a number of older devices on market, particularly in the diabetes space, where the exploitation of those devices is occurring by the user population themselves in what's called the do-it-yourself community. The FDA has been very cautious about enforcing against those patients because they understand that the patients are trying to achieve better control of their conditions themselves in light of a lack of innovation in the medical device space. That has changed, and those devices have a great deal more capability today than they had a decade ago, even 5 years ago. But FDA continues to maintain a careful stance on the basis of the public health need there. But in other instances, there have been more than a dozen cybersecurity incidents that were managed by the FDA. I was actually at FDA during the Urgent 11 and Swain Tooth incidents, and that was an all hands on deck, really everyone wearing their fireman hats incident. Each of those were actually where FDA was very assertive and calling manufacturers and saying, hi, call me back within half an hour, give me an answer. Are you affected? What do you know? What can you tell me about the risks? And that's really not an enjoyable experience, but it's something that is probably going to continue to escalate based on the trends that Axel was talking about. So FDA is pushing through based on the law that was passed at the end of 2022 and enacted in early 2023, and then the guidance that they finalized in September of 2023, and then through what is called the Electronic Submission Template and Resource, the eSTAR filing form for 510Ks, they're really pushing through. You have to include this information. If you do not, we will not even start reviewing your documentation. So while there's no longer a refuse to accept policy for 510Ks, because eSTAR won't even let you file, as you see status eSTAR incomplete in the PDF, once you do file and you get complete information in there, there's still a technical screening, and FDA will flat out refuse to continue their review of your documentation if it is incomplete in some other sense. Next slide. So really, What are the regulators looking for? They're looking for scientific methods. They're looking for cybersecurity best practices. They want it to be measurable. They want it to be repeatable, and they want it to be usable. Now, Axel mentioned that in some cases there are care delays because of cybersecurity measures implemented to deal with ransomware, for example, more complex passwords. And that is a real issue. FDA is very cautious about usability impact related to cybersecurity controls. So when you have a situation where you are concerned about the potential for a usability impact, you do need to raise your hand and ask your regulatory body how to find a good balance for usability and cybersecurity. That is absolutely critical. Next slide. So regulatory background from FDA's perspective, and they have emphasized this in numerous public fora, cyber safety is patient safety. If there is a failure in cybersecurity that could have a patient safety impact, it is not going to be acceptable. In the traditional regulatory framework under the US law, they're really looking for an assurance of safety and of effectiveness for devices. This new amendment to the Act adds a reasonable assurance of device and related systems being cyber secure. Now, I want to emphasize device and related systems because you may have a medical device data system that is connected to your device that is not itself regulated, but cybersecurity for that system, because it is connected to the device, is still considered a requirement under the law, and FDA will be asking you about those related systems. That is very, very important because a lot of manufacturers like to think, well, the stuff in the cloud that's connected, it doesn't have a medical function, but it is connected and it could be the weak link that is used to attack your medical device. So FDA will be asking lots of questions about that. They're not looking for your entire software architecture. They're looking for how you ensure security between those different connected components. They're also asking very specific questions about cryptographic algorithms and protocols, and they're looking for them to be implemented in a way to achieve secure by design. What this means is that they will be specifically looking at which algorithms you are citing use of. So if you have MD5 referred to in your documentation, you probably need to go back and take a look at what you're doing because it is obsolete. And FDA will ask questions about any obsolete cryptographic algorithms in use. And in particular, they'll be looking at all of the communication protocols that you're using. If you're citing TLS 1.0 or 1.1, they will also be asking for you to review and remove those particular types of connectivity. So it's really important to note that FDA reviewers are looking for specific keywords in your filings that they will consider to be red flags, and they will definitely raise a concern. Another area where we've seen FDA react very poorly to submissions is when manufacturers decide to roll their own crypto. And by that, I mean, somebody got the great idea that they could develop their own cryptographic algorithm. And because it's not widely used and people haven't really ever poked at it, they figured that's really secure. That's actually really insecure because it's never been tested and it hasn't been validated. And so you don't have a lot of eyes on it and a lot of people who can actually attempt to break it. And FDA will reject that entirely. So they really are looking at, you know, whether or not a widespread community of experts have poked and prodded a particular algorithm. And they're looking at whether or not an algorithm has been deprecated by an organization like the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, here in the US, or comparable agencies elsewhere in the world. So FDA is looking for a lot of cybersecurity controls, authenticity, integrity, authorization, the specific crypto algorithms, the key distribution and generation and management, confidentiality, event detection and logging. Now, that's an area that a lot of manufacturers haven't put a great deal of effort into, and it's going to be an area of a lot of attention in the future. But most importantly, update and patch. You've got to be able to update in a secure and timely manner, and you need to have reliability to that process. And ideally, you should be able to patch remotely so that you can ensure that you're getting patches out as rapidly as possible and that you can go out and check which devices have in fact received updates that are validated and affirmed. Now, that does not mean that you have to update remotely, but it does mean that FDA might ask you why you're not doing that. And if you already have connectivity in particular, they're going to be very interested in any rationalization you have for not remotely updating and patching. Next slide. So really, FDA has statutory authority now. That means it's written into law. Congress passed it. It means it's not just an interpretation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act written into some regulation. It's a lot harder to challenge the statutory authority than it would be to challenge guidance, for example, which is recommended practices only and not a requirement. The Section 524B(b)(4) leaves open the opportunity for the Secretary of HHS to identify additional regulations mandating new requirements. So that means that as the threat environment evolves, which it is doing continuously, FDA can add new regulations as they see fit. And writing that into the Act was very important because it accelerates the process of rulemaking, which is not particularly rapid in normal circumstances. And that has been very challenging for FDA because it is difficult for them to get new guidance published even, and those are just recommendations. So FDA has noted also that they're going to consider cybersecurity during inspections. A year ago, you might have heard Suzanne Schwartz talking about how the focus is on pre-market because enforcement is slow and it takes a long time, and making sure that devices are secure in the pre-market is FDA's best tool. That does not mean that they're not going to start enforcing, though. It just means that that's their second choice. But it's coming off the back burner. We know that enforcement is coming to an inspection in your near future. And we've heard directly from FDA that inspectional guidance for cybersecurity is being written. So you can expect that in future inspections, you may be asked very specific questions about your plans for cybersecurity in the post-market. And that's really important. FDA is just making sure that you're actually implementing the things that you have said that you're implementing. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act also includes provisions for repair, replacement, or refund under Section 518B. And that can include a situation where FDA determines that a device was not designed and manufactured in accordance with the then prevailing state of the art. So if you have a device on market that was cleared 20 years ago, the state of the art obviously is very different than today's state of the art. But if FDA determines that there was a situation even then that was not state of the art, and that your situation for that device causes problems, you may be required to pull that device off the market, repair, replace, or refund. And it's important to take that into today's context, because the expectation is that if you have a device that was put on market 1 year ago and it did not follow the state of the art at that time, you may be facing very expensive situations in the event of a recall today. So FDA can pull each of these different tools into their practice when they have an enforcement situation. And we mentioned harmonization earlier. This is really, really important. FDA is migrating in 2 years from the quality system regulation under Part 820 to a variation of it that looks a lot more like ISO 13485 with some minor additions. They're really looking to standardize their approach to review and to harmonize with the rest of the world to ensure that medical device manufacturers can innovate as much as possible with as little pain as possible. But they have also identified certain gaps between 13485 and 820 that they felt were unacceptable in order to move forward. Next. I'll hand over to Christian.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi, for those very valuable insights into the US system. And I want to continue with the regulatory requirements in Europe. We already heard that there are, on the highest level, several laws. And Axel already mentioned a law that is called Cyber Resilience Act, which is a very new law in Europe. And if you dig into that law, you see that medical devices are excluded. And that is because the European Medical Device Regulation and the IVD regulation already deals with security. We will see that in a couple of minutes. There are also other laws in the European area of legal requirements, like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which deals with private data belonging to individuals, that are data that is processed. And if you do data processing of individual data, then you have to fulfill the General Data and Protection Regulation. And this is also applicable to medical device manufacturers, because those devices often deal with individual data. And another law that could be interesting is the European NIS2 regulation, or directive, because this addresses companies that are relevant for the public interest. For example, ventilator machine manufacturers, if they break down due to Cybersecurity Act, that could have an impact on the public health and public health system. And so the NIS2 regulation or directive deals with those manufacturers. So if you fall under the NIS2 regulation, you have to implement security within your company IT systems. Here we are talking about the products, the medical devices themselves. And so the European Medical Device Regulation and IVD regulation is applicable. And in Annex 1, which is a very important part of that regulation, it says that security has to be fulfilled according to the state of the art. Here again, the term state of the art. And it is very tricky because you can never say what is exactly state of the art, what is the current state of the art. You have to evaluate that on your own as a manufacturer and describe that within your documentation. And there was a lot of struggle with that, and especially because security was very new to the Europeans, because before in the Medical Device Directive, no security was mentioned. And so the European Commission asked an expert group, the Medical Device Coordination Group, to create a guidance document with interpretations on security. What is security according to the state of the art? And they issued a document that was called MDCG 2019-16 in revision 1, that tries to explain what considerations you have to have regarding security of devices. If you read that document, you will feel a little bit uncomfortable because it has very abstract explanations, and you might look for more concrete, more specific advice. And you can find that advice on the level of harmonized standard. Harmonized standard means that is a standard where the European Commission assumes that it is in compliance to the underlying law, in that respect with the medical device regulation or IVD regulation. And such a harmonized standard for the MDR and IVDR for cybersecurity is not available at the moment, but we have a proposal list, and in the background they work on that harmonization. And we expect exactly in this month, in May 2024, that the IEC 81001-5-1 gets into the level of harmonized standard. And by that, this is the applicable regulatory requirement for medical device manufacturers regarding IT security. And it explains very detailed how a life cycle could look like for medical devices, starting with the planning phase or starting with even the intended use of the device regarding IT security. What is my intended environmental condition? What are the security requirements? How looks the architectural design of the product? How is it implemented in the detailed design? Then the tests that demonstrate that you fulfill all those requirements, and finally a release to the market. And it ends not at that point. You have to continue with the post-market phase. So it's pretty much the same as the FDA requires, but in a more abstract way, in a more process-related way, where it describes the abstract process, and you have to fulfill that process with specific activities. And below that level of harmonized standards, you will find many, many best practice guidances that could also be considered as state-of-the-art. For example, here I mentioned the IEC's 80001-2-2, which is a collection of security capabilities for the devices, or the next two ISO standards are related to the vulnerability handling process. And you can also find in public literature, for example, in the OWASP group, which is a group for web security, they publish a lot of information, a lot of standards, or a lot of advice how to secure systems. And that is also called state-of-the-art. And you might know that in Europe, the medical device manufacturer have to do a conformity assessment on their own, and starting with class 2A products up to class 3 products, there is also required an involvement of notified bodies, and those notified bodies make the conformity assessment. And they issued a questionnaire to be sure that everybody understands their expectations on cybersecurity. And I copied the link of those questionnaires to the bottom of that slide so that you can follow that later on. And they explain what is their current expectation, because IEC 81001-5-1 is not yet harmonized, but it will become harmonized. And so they took out the most important parts of the 81001-5-1 and explained that, or declared that as expected. Next slide, please. A common question is, where do I have to apply that 81001-5-1 standard? In general, you could say it is applicable to all devices that contain software or are software, because that is exactly what the Annex 1 of MDR and IVDR explain. The software shall be developed and manufactured in accordance with the state-of-the-art, taking into account the principles of development lifecycle and so on, including information security. So there's no distinction between different levels comparable to the software development lifecycle of IEC 62304, where we know there are safety classes A, B, C, which implies which kind of extent of documentation you have to provide. And this is not applicable for cybersecurity. Security development process is fully applicable to all respective devices that are software or that contain software in general. Next slide, please. So this is how the process of 81001-5-1 is integrated into the overall process landscape of medical device manufacturers. We already know we have to provide the risk management process according to ISO 14971, which is also a harmonized standard in Europe. And there's another harmonized standard in Europe, the IEC 62304, for the lifecycle process, software lifecycle process. And now the 81001-5-1 gets into the game as it is aligned with the 62304. So it's exactly the same sequence of development phases. And it also requires the ISO 14971 as a risk management process in the context of security. Next slide, please. This is some information about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. If electronic data processing is done on data that belongs to an identifiable or identified person, then the GDPR is applicable. And even the medical device regulation and IVD regulation refer directly to that GDPR and say this is also applicable in the context of medical devices. And I showed here two cases how the GDPR could be applied in the context of medical devices. The first case describes the situation where you create and design a medical device and hand it over to the operator, to the hospital or the end user. And you are not related as a manufacturer to the collection and processing of data. So this is done on the side of the hospital or on the side of the operator. So he's responsible for the GDPR fulfillment. But on the other hand, you can design the device in a way that the operator can fulfill the GDPR requirements. And this is called privacy by design. So you implement some basic functionalities so that the operator can fulfill the GDPR. And all those requirements are collected in a standard that is the EN 17529, which is very helpful, in my opinion, because it extracts all relevant design characteristics from the GDPR into that standard. And so you can easily apply that during your development process. The second case of applying GDPR is you as a medical device manufacturer are not only handing over the medical device to the operators, but you do some kind of data processing on your side. For example, if the medical device sends data, patient data or treatment data back to the back end that is hosted in your company or that is part of the cloud system that you are hosting. And so you are processing data, not the operator, but you as a medical device manufacturer. And in this case, the full GDPR applies to you. So that means that you need, for example, a data protection officer. You have to do a data protection impact assessment, which is a kind of specific risk assessment. You have to have contracts with the processing providers like the cloud provider and so on. So everything that is talked about in the GDPR has to be fulfilled. Next slide, please. Yeah, here are some information, but experiences from the market. We saw that there are different reactions of notified body to insufficient cybersecurity documentation. For example, once a company applied for conformity assessment and they had no IT security file at all, and then the notified body was fair and said, here is a list of deliverables and documents that we were expecting. And this was very helpful to the manufacturer. But on the other hand, they are not allowed to do it or to give advices. So it could also happen that they say, it's not a valid approach, full stop. And then you have to know what does that mean? Why are they not satisfied with my approach? Yeah, because of everything is missing. You do not provide a full comprehensive security file, and this is your wrong approach. Other things that I observed is specific notified bodies consider the state of the art very carefully. And for example, one German notified body said there is a publication of the German Federal Office for Cybersecurity, and this publication is a technical guidance. Here it is mentioned 3161, and this describes how web applications, mobile applications, or backends can be developed securely enough. And this regulation or this guidance is applicable according to that notified body because they consider it as state of the art. So be very careful in defining state of the art. Another important topic, penetration testing. It's basically mandatory for every device, and it must be done independently. That is very important, but that is similar to the FDA requirement. So be sure that you can provide a penetration test. And regarding general data protection regulation, there are penalties for violations. That is very important for the medical device manufacturers, as those penalties are very high or very impactful. And so be sure that you really fulfill the general data protection regulation in detail. Next slide, please. Yeah, comparative analysis. Maybe Naomi, you can continue.
Sorry, Naomi, we can't hear you.
I was muted. As Christian mentioned, the way that MDR and IVDR look at cyber devices is a little bit different than the way that the FDA looks at cyber devices. So MDR and IVDR indicate that medical devices that contain or are software follow the principles of IT security according to the state of the art. FDA is a little bit more specific and detailed in the way that they define a cyber device. And it's actually really important to note that the three criteria that are laid out in the Section 524B of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are anded. Now, we added one of the word and to the end of bullet 1, because it's not actually there in the statute, just to emphasize the fact that all 3 of these characteristics must be true to be a cyber device. You include software, you have the ability to connect to the internet, not necessarily the intention to do so, and you contain technology characteristics that are validated, installed, or authorized that could be vulnerable to a cybersecurity threat. Quite frankly, I perceive any software that's installed on a device to be potentially vulnerable. So I think 1 and 3 are a little bit redundant, but these are ANDed. So a cyber device is only something that all 3 of these characteristics are true for. The guidance, these 3 characteristics are ORed. The guidance is a set of recommendations, which FDA is holding people to pretty strictly. But that's a little bit different in terms of whether or not you can push back on FDA. If you have a cyber device, there is no pushing back. You have a legal requirement to provide cybersecurity documentation. If you do not have a cyber device, you may make an argument, which FDA may not find compelling, about how much of the cybersecurity information requested in the guidance must be provided. In Europe, though, there's no differentiation. And where in the US, there used to be a differentiation based on this idea of level of concern, and there is still an expectation that cybersecurity controls and documentation can scale with risk. In Europe, that is not true. There's no differentiation. And in fact, 81001-5-1 states that the manufacturer have to define in their quality management system which devices follow the secure development framework. And this is really based on the respective market requirements. So what we have here are 2 slightly different approaches that really converge on the same idea. And that is, if you have software, there's the potential for a vulnerability. Connectivity may or may not be intentional, but if you have an externally facing port, for example, a USB port, even if you weren't planning on it being used, if it is accessible to a user, they may misuse it, they may abuse it. And somebody who likes to poke and prod at things and sees a button on the wall that says don't touch is probably going to make the effort and touch it. So what you don't want is somebody walking up and saying, oh, here's a cool medical device, let me connect it to a Flipper Zero, and now it's connected to the internet. And that is a thing that can in fact happen. So it is very critical to note the differences here, but the objective is largely the same. FDA and Europe are both saying that medical devices, because of the way that they are used, should be secure to protect patients from a safety perspective and from a privacy perspective. Christian?
Yeah, exactly. And that means if your device has only a USB device, in both markets, you should provide an IT security file. It's not enough to say my justification is there is only a local interface, so I do not need sophisticated IT security measures. No, you have to provide it. Yeah, the next slide about similarities. Both markets require adequate security development processes. FDA is quite open. They say it's a recognized consensus standard to use the 81001-5-1. In Europe, it will be more binding because it will be harmonized, but it can also use the NIST framework in the US market as a kind of total lifecycle process framework. And the security risk management process is always based on the 14971, ISO 14971, and may be implemented according to AMI TIR 57 or the AMI or ANSI SW 96 or the TIR 97, because that are state-of-the-art requirements regarding risk management for IT security. Both markets emphasize post-market security surveillance and maintenance. Naomi said that already for the FDA. What are the expectations? We saw that, or we see that FDA requires a cybersecurity management plan. So that's more a product-related document that you have to provide. And the Europeans focus more on the quality management system, so they expect a description of post-market security activities within the quality management system. But I think that's a minor formal difference. Both markets apply a fairly broad definition of applicability. That is what we said before regarding the USB port. Okay. Next slide. FDA, what are the differences? FDA puts a lot more emphasis on the SBOM, the software bill of material, because they specify exactly what is the content of that SBOM. Naomi already mentioned the NTIA specifications, the baseline attributes that should be used for that, and FDA specifies additional requirements for the SBOM in the guidance document. FDA requires not only threat modeling. Threat modeling is a requirement that comes also for the Europeans out of the 81001-5-1. And by the way, it is also mentioned in the MDCG guidance document. So threat modeling as a risk methodology must be applied, and there must be sophisticated documentation, comprehensive documentation about that. But in the US, the FDA requires a little bit more because they focus on different views within the threat modeling. So it's not about only the static system diagram, which is usually the base of the threat modeling. They also require multi-patient harm view, security use case views, update and patch views. So different kind of diagrams with different kind of security cases or perspectives to investigate for possible threats. And FDA wants to see metrics for post-market vulnerability management, like how long was the time between getting aware of, becoming aware of vulnerability and providing a patch or rolling out that patch. So you must measure that and provide those metrics in your post-market documentation also to the FDA. So this is really a very specific requirement by the FDA, which is not common in Europe. In general, the Europeans harmonized the 81001-5-1, and by that, the Annex F becomes kind of mandatory. And this is interesting because the annexes in such a harmonized standard usually describe additional information and are not mandatory. They are only informative, not that are not related to the core requirements of the standard. But Annex F is a kind of requirement in the standard, and it describes how to deal with legacy devices. Or they don't call it legacy device, they call it software in transition, which means they expect that you transfer your old devices that are currently in the market into cybersecure devices. So you have to apply a kind of full-featured development process for your devices that are currently in the market to bring them into a secure level. And this is also what Naomi already said about the FDA. They expect kind of dealing with the legacy devices, not only by doing post-market activities, but for example, to consider IT security also in change projects. If you change your device, if you maintain your software, then you have to deal with security again in the development process. Okay.
Great. Thanks, Naomi and Christian. I'm going to wrap up. We only have a few minutes left, so I'll keep it short. So what are some of the key elements we learned today in terms of how can you as a manufacturer translate laws, regulations, and requirements into actionable things you can implement? Obviously, implement a secure development lifecycle. Use ISO 14971 as an umbrella for risk management. But if you're specifically looking for guidance on how to realize cybersecurity under that umbrella, look at IVDR 57 pre-market and 97 post-market, as well as SW96 to support, again, secure device lifecycle management. Then establish measures for managing cybersecurity risk, right? Understand what is your risk posture, what is your exposure, what are your gaps, and make a plan to close those gaps. Focus on the key elements, including your supply chain, including threat modeling, including continual testing during development and integration, and then obviously apply, as Christian was mentioned, state-of-the-art security best practices, be it 80,001-2-2, OWASP, or other guidances provided, for example, through HSCC, the Joint Security Plan, recently updated to a version 2. One point that is emphasized repeatedly, and we have seen a lot of pushback if it was not followed, is the aspect of traceability, right? You establish your security requirements, you identify security risks, and you implement controls and mitigations during your development. But then in the end, you need to confirm that you meet your requirements and that your identified risks are mitigated through testing, right? So make sure that you have complete traceabilities from requirements over risks, over your controls, to testing, confirming that those controls address the risks and work as intended. Security testing, there's a lot of practical guidance out there, whether that is things like code review and static and dynamic application security testing, fuzz testing, penetration testing, ideally performed by an independent entity, and then also obviously look at best practices for cross-Atlantic and international cooperation, because you want to minimize your efforts to comply with regulations. So you don't want to send up separate systems for the US and the EU and other regions, but be aware that some regions have very unique requirements. For example, here in the US, if you perform usability testing, then you need to actually conduct the testing by using US citizens as participants. So again, try to harmonize your approach, but understand unique differences and find local experts and local consultants as needed. And I think with that, we're at the top of the hour. Maybe a couple of more questions if people want to stick around for a moment, and then we'll wrap up. Naomi or Christian, do you want to pick any of the questions in the chat?
Yeah, I've been answering some of the questions in real time in the text messaging, but you know, there are some questions that I think are worth discussing further. With regard to FDA's definition of a cyber device, FDA has recently issued draft guidance that add to the definition. So any connectivity makes the device a cyber device. What they're really trying to say there is maybe you didn't intend for it to be connected, but you have a port externally facing, whether it's a wired or wireless port. They treat that as connected because it is connectable. And that's where that emphasis on the one slide of ability to connect comes into play. Sure, you stuck a USB port there, and it's so that your technicians can upload new firmware to your device in the field, but it's not intended for the user to use. Well, the user could nonetheless connect something to it and could potentially cause a denial of availability to the device or something like that. So FDA's focus there and those minor changes that they've made through that draft that they've put out this year is really focused on giving more concrete examples to the industry about what their expectations are there. And harmonization with respect to different standards. The way that Europe uses standards is very different from the way that FDA does. So I'll let Christian address the EU harmonization. I will just say that from an FDA perspective, all consensus standards are considered voluntary usage. So whether a standard is recognized by FDA or not, you may use it. If you do use it and it's not recognized, be aware that FDA may tell you that they don't really know that standard and they need you to justify why it's comparable to one that they do recognize. But Christian, do you want to address the EU harmonization?
Regarding what? Regarding the standards?
Regarding IEC 81001-5-1, including Annex F. which requires the implementation of cyber controls retroactively to devices already on market?
Yeah, it's a matter of interpretation, because now it is kind of state of the art, and if it gets into the level of harmonization, then it's like you said about the FDA, the notified bodies will expect that you fulfill that standard for sure. And if you do not fulfill this standard, then they require a justification for your own solution that it is also in compliance to the underlying law. And this is a very tricky and heavy activity to provide that justification. So you should clearly stick to the 81001-5-1. And regarding the Annex F, we are not sure now how the notified bodies will react on that. They did not tell us so much so far how they will consider that, but we expect that they will follow the Annex F, so they will insist on fulfilling it. And I would create, as soon as possible, project plans about implementing 81001-5-1 into your quality management system and how to implement security into your devices that are currently in the market.
Okay. Since we're over, maybe just quickly to the last question here in the chat, and then we'll wrap up. Question is specifically, does NIST CSF 2, Cybersecurity Framework 2, provide a good start for a starting company? So the simple answer is yes. I mean, this CSF is a good framework that highlights a pretty solid approach in developing a cybersecurity program, starting with governance down to very specific protection, detection, response type of activities. So it is a good checklist for a starting company. The concern I would have is twofold. A, is it complete, or do you need more detail in some areas? I think the answer to that is yes, you will. Right? Again, it's a framework, it's a checklist, but detailed implementations require probably that you look at other practices to use those, and NIST to an extent gives pointers in those directions. The second part is NIST CSF2 was developed for your typical, let's call it enterprise use case, right? You have a company that runs a cloud service, that runs a traditional enterprise IT network and data center and whatnot, and CSF2 is certainly a good guidance for that. But if you want to apply it to your development program for medical devices, your quality system, cybersecurity aspects, then I think you will encounter some gaps and shortfalls that you need to address elsewhere, because that was not intended to be addressed by NIST CSF2. Not saying you can't use it, but I'm saying that you probably have to do some thinking, interpretation, and adjustment for that purpose.
We should be able to answer any outstanding questions in follow-up via email.
Yeah, we have the names, and the PDFs will be available. So with that, yeah, we also have, when you get the PDF, contact information, as well as then a slide with additional resources. Thank you, Naomi and Christian, for joining. Great presentation, valuable content. And thanks everybody who joined online today. Appreciate your interest, and feel free to reach out to us directly.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.